Let's decode the life of a thinker who changed the way we read texts, Jacques Derrida. Born in Algeria and later settled in France, Derrida became one of the most powerful voices of post-structuralism and postmodern philosophy. He is remembered as the architect of deconstruction, a method that constantly questions meaning, language, and the hidden contradictions within text. Now pause here and note this carefully, his famous phrase from Off Grammatology published in 1967. There is nothing outside the text. This was again asked in exam, so don't miss it. Derrida's point was simple, yet radical texts don't point directly to some external reality. Instead, meaning always comes from the endless play of words in relation to other words. Can you recall Saussure's idea of science working through difference? Derrida pushed that idea further, blending it with Husserl's phenomenology and Heidegger's ontology. The result was deconstruction, a practice of close reading that unsettles binaries like speech versus writing, presence versus absence, or even male versus female. The trick here is that meaning never settles. It always slips away into what Derrida called difference. Across his career, Derrida published more than 40 books and countless essays. And here's something you must note down. The chronology of his works has been asked in exams. The year 1967 alone gave us three classics: Writing and Difference, Of Grammatology, and Speech and Phenomena. In the 1970s came Dissemination, Positions, and Margins of Philosophy. Later, he produced Glass in 1974, The Postcard in 1980, Limited Incorporated in 1988, and the famous Spectres of Marx in 1993. He didn't stop there. Archive Fever appeared in 1995, and even after his death, The Animal That Therefore I Am was published in 2008. This one's a classic UGC trap, so be careful. Derrida's major essays are just as important. In 1963, he wrote Cogito and the History of Madness. In 1966, he delivered Structure, Sign, and Play in the Discourse of the Human Sciences. And in 1989, he gave us The Rhetoric of Drugs. His interview collections, like Positions in 1972 and Points covering interviews from 1974 to 1994, also reveal how his thought kept evolving. Let's decode two of Derrida's most important works from the year 1967. And pause here. This year is a landmark because three of his classics were published together: Writing and Difference, Of Grammatology, and Speech and Phenomena. This fact has been asked in exam, so you must remember it. First, Writing and Difference. This collection of essays and lectures introduced Derrida to the international stage. Here, he examined great thinkers like Foucault, Bataille, and Levinas through close reading. And now here's the golden trick. Derrida showed that when you read texts very carefully, they often betray themselves. What they try to prove ends up being undermined by their own contradictions. This is the essence of deconstruction. Meaning is never fixed, never final, always sliding, always deferred. Can you recall? This is exactly where Derrida laid the groundwork for deconstruction's central idea, language, and presence are unstable, always shifting under pressure. Now, Off Grammatology. This is Derrida's most famous and most frequently cited book, asked several times in exam. So highlight it in your notes. What's the central argument? Derrida takes on what he calls phonocentrism, the Western tradition of giving higher status to speech over writing. Pause here and note this down. This question was recently asked in exam. Philosophers for centuries believed speech carried presence, authenticity, and truth, while writing was only a fallen copy. Derrida flips this idea on its head, showing that speech is no more pure than writing. Both are unstable. Both are caught in the endless play of science. Here's something you'll love. Of Grammatology also introduces key terms you must master. First is difference, meaning is produced through difference and always delayed. Second is trace, every sign carries within it the shadow of other signs, preventing fixed meaning. And third is logocentrism, the privileging of speech and presence as a supposed foundation of truth. These three concepts, difference, trace, and logocentrism, have all been asked in exams, so don't skip them. Think of it this way. Derrida was battling structuralism. Thinkers like Lévi-Strauss and Lacan still believed in hidden structures of meaning beneath the surface. Derrida's deconstruction said, no, there are no stable structures. Texts are riddled with aporias, logical dead ends, and ellipses, those little gaps that undo their claims. Let's decode one of the most important lectures of 20th century theory, Jacques Derrida's Structure, Sign, and Play in the Discourse of the Human Sciences. He delivered this lecture in 1966 at Johns Hopkins University during a conference on structuralism. Pause here, this detail was asked in exam, so note it carefully. The lecture was later published in 1967 as Chapter 10 of Writing and Difference. Many critics see this very moment as the birth of post-structuralism. Derrida begins with an observation that feels simple yet profound. Philosophers always accuse one another of using unstable or flawed language, but none of us can escape it. Why? Because language itself is inherited, shaped by history, and never fully pure. This insight sets the stage for his deconstructive critique of structuralism. Derrida borrows a striking example from Claude Lévi-Strauss's Anthropology, the idea of bricolage. And yes, this too was asked in exam, so underline it. A bricoleur is someone who creates with whatever tools are already at hand. Derrida insists that we are all bricoleurs, we can't invent ideas out of nothing. We must work with concepts already given by culture and language. By saying this, Derrida undermines the structuralist dream of a scientific, self-contained system of science. Even structuralism, he shows, is bricolage. Can you recall Saussures' system of science? Derrida admires its abstraction but points out its limitation. Structuralism still clings to the idea of a center, a fixed anchor like God, truth, being, or man. But here's the catch. The center is supposed to stabilize the system while also being outside it. Derrida exposes this paradox, showing that Western thought is basically a history of replacing one center with another. And now comes his radical move, the idea of play. Instead of stable centers, Derrida proposes that structures are fields of free play with no ultimate foundation. This destroys the comfort of metaphysics, but opens the door to deconstruction. Let's decode some of the most important Derridian concepts that examiners love to ask. Pause here and stay sharp because several of these have already appeared in UGC NET papers. First up, we have aporia. Now, this was asked in exam, so be extra careful. Aporia means a kind of deadlock or impasse inside a text, an irresolvable contradiction. Derrida shows us that language itself carries this instability. Think of it like this. Every time thought tries to pin down truth, rhetoric slips away, and when rhetoric tries to dominate, thought resists. That conflict is aporia. It's not a puzzle you can solve, it's the very condition of language. Keyword memory trick. Aporia equals conflict between rhetoric and thought. Next, the heart of his philosophy, deconstruction. And remember, deconstruction is not about destroying meaning. It's about carefully taking structures apart to see where they contradict themselves. Derrida reveals how binaries like speech and writing, presence and absence, or male and female are never fixed. Instead, texts generate unstable, shifting meanings. So, the core idea here is simple. The relationship between text and meaning is always in flux. Now let's see difference. This term looks almost like difference but has that sneaky And yes, this too was asked in exam. Difference captures two intertwined moves, difference and differal. Meaning comes through differences between words, but it never fully arrives. It's always postponed, always deferred. That's why Derrida says meaning is like a traveler who never reaches the final destination. Pause here and note the key word, difference and differal of meaning. Moving on, we have phallogocentrism. This was recently asked in exam, so it's very fresh. Derrida coined this mouthful to critique Western philosophy's masculine bias. Let's break the word. Phallo means privileging the male, logo means privileging speech and presence, and phonocentrism means privileging the spoken sound over writing. Together, phallogocentrism exposes how traditions give authority to male-centered meaning systems. Derrida explores this powerfully in Plato's Pharmacy. And finally, we come to remainder, also called reste. This too was recently asked in exam. The remainder is what meaning leaves behind, something unassimilated, something that resists being fully explained. But here's the twist. It's not just a scrap or leftover. The remainder shows that no system of meaning is ever complete. There's always a surplus, always something outside the frame. In other words, closure is impossible, interpretation is endless. Let's decode free play. Derrida introduced this in his 1966 lecture, Structure, Sign and Play in the Discourse of the Human Sciences. Imagine a structure that once had a fixed center truth, God or reason. Derrida calls the collapse of this fixed center the event. After this shift, there is no single anchor and meaning is left to free play. Interpretation becomes bricolage, meaning we build meaning using whatever tools are at hand. Pause here and note this carefully. There is no final essence, only endless play. Now let's move to RK writing and pause, because this was asked in exam. Traditionally, Western thinkers like Plato, Rousseau and even Saussure treated speech as primary and writing as secondary. Derrida flips this idea. He argues that writing, or more precisely, the trace comes before both speech and writing. RK writing means the structural possibility of difference and deferral, what Derrida calls deference, that makes all language possible. Next is archive fever from 1995 again, asked in exam. Here Derrida draws on Freud. He says archives are paradoxical. They preserve memory but at the same time produce loss, repression and forgetting. He links this to Freud's death drive, the strange human urge to both preserve and destroy. So archives are never neutral. They are always shaped by power, desire, and the struggle between memory and oblivion. Next, metaphysics of presence. Derrida critiques the entire Western tradition for privileging presence, immediate truth, essence, being over absence, difference, and mediation. From Plato to Heidegger, philosophy kept seeking an unmediated truth, but deconstruction insists meaning is never fully present. It is always deferred, mediated by traces, and haunted by absence. Let's look at Cora. This one has been asked several times in exams, so be careful. Plato used Cora to describe a receptacle or space of being. Derrida deconstructs this term to show that it resists definition. It is neither being nor non-being, but a strange in-between space that destabilizes binaries. Later, Julia Kristeva picked up this concept to distinguish between semiosis, the process of meaning-making, and symbolism. Finally, we arrive at the idea of the trace again, asked in exam. Central to works like of grammatology and writing and difference, the trace means that every sign carries the mark of something absent. Presence is never pure. It is always shaped by what is not there. The trace makes sure no sign stands alone. Language is always relational, haunted by its others. Here comes hauntology, a term Derrida coined in his book Spectres of Marx, published in 1993. It plays on the word ontology. But instead of focusing on pure being, it reminds us that the present is always haunted by ghosts of the past, unresolved histories, lingering specters, unfinished business. This one breaks the idea of time being straight and linear. Instead, hauntology shows how the past keeps returning, refusing closure. Now, let's move to invagination. Derrida borrows this metaphor from biology. Imagine a text folding into itself where the inside and the outside blur. That's invagination. It shows us how texts are never cleanly bounded. Instead, they loop back on themselves, making boundaries unstable. Pause here and note this down. It's a classic deconstruction move. Next is pharmakon, one of Derrida's most playful explorations. In Plato's Pharmacy, he unpacks the Greek word pharmakon, which intriguingly means both remedy and poison. See the trick here? Writing for Plato was a cure for forgetfulness, but also a danger to living memory. This undecidability shows why meaning can never be pinned down once and for all. Then we have Sau's Rature or under erasure. Derrida borrowed this technique from Heidegger. Here's how it works. You write a word, but then you cross it out, leaving it still visible. Why? To show that language is necessary, but never sufficient. Now, on to theology. It was recently asked in exam. The word first came from Kant, but Heidegger turned it into a powerful critique of Western philosophy. On to theology means philosophy tries to ground, being in some ultimate principle, usually God. Derrida observed that even Heidegger, while criticizing this move, still ended up writing a theology with and without God. The big takeaway, Western thought remains trapped in ontotheology. And finally, a term that's been asked several times in exam, bricolage. This comes from Claude Lévi-Strauss in his book The Savage Mind from 1962. Bricolage means problem solving with whatever materials you have on hand instead of building from scratch. Derrida applies this to philosophy. Every thinker is a bricoler, borrowing ideas from what already exists. The myth of the original engineer who creates entirely new ideas is false. In reality, all philosophy and criticism are bricolage.